We're finally back to our Hall of Faith series. We were doing this series for a while, and then we had to take a little break because the fall festivals were upon us, and I always do some videos for our festival edition playlist, so it's been probably a month since we were here, and we left off right in the middle of a kind of like a key moment and a key pause. It was kind of perfect timing to pause in Hebrews 11, and so we're going to pick back up where we left off. And I want to stay open as we kind of dive into this. I want to stay open to the fact that pause, there was kind of a key paragraph in Hebrews 11 where it talked about all these different, it talked about creation, it talked about Abel, and it talked about Enoch and Noah and Avram and Sarah, all these characters, and then it had this like paragraph where it kind of breaks the list, and it says all these people were still living by faith when they died. And, you know, they saw their promises, they walked up, and it's kind of this poetic, it's not really a benediction, but it was this weird break. And so what I want to do as we look at this is I want to stay open to the possibility that the author may be doing something here. Like there may be a shift. There may be a juncture, a change in topic, or a change in point or intention. There might be something new. It may be more of the same. So I don't want to assume one way or another. This would be a logical place where if the author wants to somewhat shift gears or start doing something unique that the author hasn't been doing prior to that, it may happen here. And I don't know. I'm going to try to treat this. And again, we don't want to look at these passages. We don't want to look at these verses or these references or these paragraphs. We don't want to look at them in a vacuum. I think it's what we're used to. I was somewhat trained in that when I was in Bible college. Like, take a passage, take that passage and then exegete it, find the proposition. Now, on my better days, I was trained to pay attention to context. I think kind of our out-of-pocket, knee-jerk reaction is to kind of forget about context and just see a paragraph, a verse, a reference, just kind of like almost in a vacuum, and just say, like, what's the point of this? But that's really bad biblical hermeneutics. What we want to do is we want to be able to take a passage and see it in its larger context, which is what we've been doing all throughout the passage of Hebrews. We actually went all the way back and we peeked into Hebrews 10 to see what it was that the author was doing and what it was that got us into Hebrews 11. What is the flow of conversation that sets the stage? And we found that the author of Hebrews was saying, we cannot be people that shrink back. Like, we have to remain faithful. We have to lean in. We have to keep showing up. We have to stay true to the we have to hold the faith because we know what it is to suffer, and we know what it is to stand by people that suffer. And suffering can cause us to question the veracity of the faith that we're clinging to. Suffering can cause us to wonder whether or not it's worth it. And the author of Hebrews is saying, I know that you know what it is to suffer. And I know that you know what it is to stand by other people who are suffering. And it's for this very purpose that we can't give up. Like, we have to keep leaning in. We have to stay true. We can't be people that shrink back. And we saw how the author even alluded to Habakkuk. Like, we've been here before. We know what exile tastes like. And we can't be people that shrink back from that. We have to keep going. And so into Hebrews 11, what we found is that all these references, these people are in the hall of faith because they're willing to walk the path of life with this belief, this conviction, this awareness, this consciousness of something. Like, it's not just about the things that I see. It's not just about the things that I feel and experience. God is bigger than what I can perceive right in front of me. What God is doing in the world is bigger than my present circumstances. And that is not to gloss over or to speak ill or to trivialize my present circumstances. Quite the opposite. It's actually to look at this story of all these people that went through stuff, and yet we're willing to say, I think there's something more going on here. And I'm going to give myself to those greater principles. I'm going to give myself to God. I'm going to trust the story. I'm going to lean into the things that I believe are more important or more long-lasting or more true than what I'm tempted to, in my immediate circumstances, be tossed into despair by. And these people, like, had promises. They believed that God was up to something. God had made promises about what he was going to do in the world. And so these people chased those promises, and they even discovered that they weren't even going to, like, they saw the promises in the distance. They realized that they weren't even going to, in the words of that paragraph from our last video about a month ago, like, all these people died without receiving what had been promised. But they saw what God was doing and welcomed it from a distance. And God was not ashamed to be called their God. And so now we kind of dive back in, and I want to wonder if, is God doing something? Is the author doing something new in Hebrews, or is there something else at play? And so I'm going to pick up where we left off in verse 17 of Hebrews chapter 11. We read this: "By faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. Even though God had said to him, 'It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned,' Abraham reasoned," it's an interesting word, he reasoned, he logically concluded. So we're not talking about being illogical here. We're not talking about throwing reason out the window. He reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So, first of all, the author dives right back in. The author left off talking about Avram and Sarah and Isaac, and then says none of these people saw, not Noah, not Abel, not Enoch, none of these people saw what was promised. Avram and Sarah, they didn't receive what was promised. But let's get right back where we left off, the author says. How about Abraham when he sacrificed Isaac? Now I want to stop here because this is the kind of story, and we're familiar with this story. Abraham goes to offer to sacrifice and offer Isaac on the altar on top of the mountain, and God waits to the last minute, and then an angel says, "Stop! Here's a ram. I'll provide the sacrifice." And we'll link the episode. There's a BEMA Podcast episode where we talk about that story, and we'll link that if you want to go review that story. That'll be in the description of this video. But for a lot of people, when they think about this story, a lot of people might say, this is what's wrong with religion. Like, you have this story of a God asking a father to sacrifice his own son, to kill and murder his own son, for religious reasons. And this is portrayed as like great faith. And people in our world today would say, that's not great faith. That's not. See, that's what's wrong with religion. Religion calls this kind of like demented, distorted, disturbing stuff, it calls it faith. And part of it is seeing the story in historical context. Like all the gods that Abraham was used to demand child sacrifice. This is something he's relatively used to in the religious world of his day. So God's meeting him in this world and trying to tell him that, in fact, he's not like all those other gods. That's part of it. But there's still a part of this story that makes us, like, recoil, and appropriately so. In fact, there's another episode I'll link in the description of this video, where later on in the podcast, like 200 episodes later, like 4 years later, we actually record what is one of my favorite podcast episodes I've ever recorded, where we look at this story through the lens of trauma. Like, Isaac had to have been unbelievably traumatized through this experience. And so we look at that through the lens of trauma, both for Isaac, both this Abraham's trauma, I'm trying to do the right thing, the dysfunction that it causes within the family. We kind of pull all that apart. So I don't want to address that. I don't want to ignore that as we talk about faith. What is the author trying to get at when he says it's by faith that Abraham did this? The author seems to pinpoint, seems to home in on some very particular details of this story. And so there is a midrash. What is midrash? Midrash is Jewish commentary. And the author in Hebrews here seems to very directly be talking about this midrash. There's a story, a commentary about the sacrifice of Isaac that says, and Jewish midrash can be crazy sometimes. Jewish midrash can tell like these fanciful, you're like, how in the world did that? It feels rather arbitrary. And it's because the story's trying to tell us about wisdom, that it's trying to get us to see something that's deep deeply embedded in this story that we might miss on a cursory reading. And so the midrash is telling us a story about the story, and it's making us go look again, look deeper. And so there's a midrash that says that when Abraham and Isaac got to the top of the mountain, you might notice it says he has a knife, it says he has the materials for the fire. It never says that he has rope. And yet Isaac is bound and put on top of the altar. Now we might just assume that the rope is not mentioned, but the Jewish commentary says, well, wait a minute, where was the rope? And it says actually what happens is that Isaac essentially binds himself. He ties his own binds, and they might not even be literal binds. It makes me think of like the story of Polycarp. If any of you know that, he was going to be burned at the stake, and they go to attach his limbs to nail his hands to the stake, and Polycarp says, you don't need to fasten me to the stake. I'll stand here. I'm not going to go anywhere. I'll stand here while I burn to death. And that's, as history tells it, that's what happens to Polycarp. This Jewish commentary says something very similar, that Isaac is willing to tie his own binds, to lay himself on the altar. Now again, this feels like, Marty, you're not making this any better. You're making this like worse. Like this story feels like it's getting more and more sick. Well, one version of this story, one version of this midrash, this commentary, goes on to say that, in fact, on top of the mountain, Abraham actually did. He went through with the sacrifice. You'll notice at the end of the story, Isaac doesn't come down the mountain with Abraham. Abraham and Isaac are on the mountain, at the top of the mountain, at the bottom of the mountain, all that kind of stuff. But then at the end of the story, only Abraham goes down the mountain. So one version of the Jewish story says Abraham actually sacrificed Isaac. He went through with it, even though the story reads a particular way. And then 3 days later, Isaac is raised from the dead. It seems to me that the author of Hebrews seems to be looking towards, not quoting, maybe not even supporting, but looking towards that midrash. Now here's the point of the writer of Hebrews seems to cling to. The point of that midrash is not that that's literally what happened in history. The point of the Jewish commentary is that the wisdom of the story is that Abraham and Isaac were so committed to following God. We could say things like so committed to obedience. I don't know if that language is helpful for us or not. But they were willing to trust in God's instructions so much that they were willing to go even to the point of death, trusting that God had something, which is literally what the author of Hebrews says here, right? The author of Hebrews says, he who embraced the promises, so Abraham was somebody who trusts the story, he embraced the promises, he was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it's through Isaac your offspring will be reckoned. So God had told Abraham, he had promised him, that through Isaac he would have descendants. But Abraham's willing to go all the way through with his sacrifice because he reasoned, not because he's crazy, not because he said, if God made a promise, God has to make good on his promise. So if I kill my son, he must have plans to raise him from the dead. That's how it reads here in Hebrews. That's what the midrash seems to hint at in the Jewish commentary. And the author of Hebrews here seems to know this midrashic commentary, this midrashic thought. The writer of Hebrews seems to say, these people were willing to go beyond what surface level reasoning, surface level logic, it doesn't make any sense on the surface, but they had faith, and faith took them underneath the surface. Faith took them beyond the surface. Faith said, if God's asking me to do this, and God has made me a promise, there must be a way that these two things come together that I might not understand. It must be beyond my ability to conceive or to imagine what this could look like. But God said to do this, and God said he would do this, and he can't lie. So and the author of Hebrews says, that's faith. Now think about what that means for the author's audience. Like here we are suffering for what we believe in. It would seem that God's not making good on his promise. But the author of Hebrews says, go further, look beyond. We have to be people that don't shrink back. We have to be people of faith, believing that if God's made this promise, And if this is there must be a way that these two things come together. If the people of God, if the history of our faith is full of stories of people choosing to believe this, then we need to believe this now. And I don't know necessarily, in my context or your context, a year of our Lord 2024, for me, I'm in America, like I don't know what necessarily the application is for my immediate context or yours, but if you find yourself in a place where you know what faithfulness looks like, you know what it looks like, but it doesn't seem like it should work out. Like why would I try to do that? Why would I endure this? And I'm not talking about enduring abuse, or I'm not talking about any of that. I'm not talking about that. But if you find yourself in circumstances where it seems like my faith is hopeless, believe that faith is bigger than that, because that's what Noah did. That's what Enoch did. That's what Abel did. That's what Sarah did. That's what Avram did, more than once. Over and over again, Avram, the father of faith, shows up in the hall of faith to say, don't lose hope. Believe that God has to be up to something bigger than your circumstances, larger than your understanding. Reason, when it looks like it's unreasonable, reason that God's involvement changes the ball game. And believe that there must be something more that we can't see. It's what our faith is built upon. We can't be people that shrink back. We can't be people that are driven and shaped and directed by our immediate circumstances and surface level logic. We have to believe that our entire history is littered with stories of God saying, I know it looks like this, but I'm doing this. And sometimes that will mean rescue and deliverance for us. And sometimes it will mean that we die without having received the promises of God. But it will mean that we are a part of something that truly is bigger than our circumstances, sometimes bigger than our own lives or our own generations. Because God really is putting the world back together. At least that's what we believe if we hold to the story of faith. And the writer says, don't give up. Keep leaning in. Keep believing that even though it seems like the craziest stuff sits in front of you, God must be up to something beautiful. Trust in God. Trust in that goodness. We might say trust in that resurrection. Abraham did. And what seemed illogical, trusting in resurrection in Abraham's day, that seems illogical. And yet Abraham would tell us, according to the writer of Hebrews, it was the only reasonable explanation I could give. So may we be inspired by that. And may we be ready to look at the next. I think Isaac actually might be the next person that shows up in our Hall of Faith. So we'll find out in our next video.